Thank you so much. It's a great blessing to be here at my home church where I was baptized, I think in 1954, the year of the Brown decision, a long time ago. And it's nice to see some of you here who are not members of my family. Many of you are, though. I have to admit that I was not always in my youth tremendously reverent during these services. One of the practices that I confess is that I would sit up in the balcony almost where the technical fellow is up there with my friend Tyler Burge, who's now the chairman of the philosophy department at UCLA, and we would go through an exercise every Sunday of rating in great detail the ladies' hats that we saw spread out before us. We would, and I'm sorry to say there are very, very few, if any, here today, but back then they were in profusion, and we would rate them for altitude, circumference, ornamentation, and color contrast. So we had our own, and it was a wonderful exercise in the bond of the church. And this church, I'm thankful today, has already set the mood for Dr. King in the worship, in the songs, in the music. Ms. Johnson singing the Mozart. My mom took me to the Atlanta Boy Choir when I was about 6, even before I joined the church. And the first song we learned was the Mozart Alleluia that Ms. Johnson sang. Not quite as elaborate as her version or as gifted, but that's the first one we sang. And then later, I also have to think this is the only other time I've stood in this pulpit was for Pop's funeral 15 years ago. So I'm back, and it makes me, of course, think of him and of why a white Southerner growing up in Atlanta would have devoted, it's now 35 years of my life devoted to research on why race is at the heart of our civic and our spiritual authenticity in this country. Some of it began with Mom and her driving me to the boy choir and bringing me to this church, but some of it began with Pop. He would take me to the Atlanta Crackers games. You know, people when I travel the country don't believe that our baseball team was named the Atlanta Crackers, but I know that's not strange to you, or even that the Negro League team was the Atlanta Black Crackers, which is really strange. But we would go in the laundry truck with Peter Mitchell, who was Pop's cleaner, and they had a daily bet on the Crackers games of 25 cents, and they both had a great gift for telling jokes and remembering punchlines, and they would banter all the way down. Peter, of course, bet against the Crackers and said they were no good and that my dad should pay up in advance. And my dad would answer him, give as good as he got. But then when we started to go into Ponce de Leon ballpark, the mood turned somber because Peter had to go sit in the colored section, and that's one of the few direct memories I have of segregation in those days. But what I really remember is that Pop occasionally would say, "I don't like this," and that's all he would say. And even as a very small boy, I knew not to even ask why or what is this, because the fact that we were separating and the mood had gone from jovial interaction to silence, even a small boy could feel this was the chasm of race. And you don't ask about it because it was dangerous. And it began my questioning of where this went and where it came from and how it affected our lives growing up in Atlanta, where, strangely enough, all of my friends were deeply devoted to black music, which was just then coming over the airwaves, and we would sneak out to go to Herndon Stadium to hear Sanctified Ray Charles, or some of my friends even went down to the Royal Peacock Club to hear Jackie Wilson sing. There were these crossover things going on that began to fascinate me until it turned the direction of my whole life inside out. So I want to thank Second-Ponce for bringing me back to talk a little bit about lessons across the racial divide that influences us so profoundly in both. I call it the gate to freedom. Either way, it opens up the gates to our faith, but it also can be used to shut us off from the truest meaning of our faith. And I think with Ms. Banks and is it Ms. Kern, the lady who did, you've really spoken Dr. King's message already. My wife, Christy, is an alto in our church choir in Baltimore, singing at this moment. She sings alto, and as an added touch, you even put me next to the altos. I was listening to them, and it made me feel right at home. So thank you for the inspiration. The scripture that was read is very, very unusual. That entire passage is in the mouth of Jesus. It's a quotation from Jesus. He's telling a story. And it's a rare story because it involves heaven and hell. There are not that many passages in the Bible where Jesus talks about the afterlife. But here's one in which he not only talks about the afterlife, but he's quoting dialogue between heaven and hell with Abraham and other biblical figures involved. Back and forth. It was Dr. King's, one of his favorite topics. He talked and preached about and cited the story of Lazarus and Dives, which was the name given to the rich man, more often than any other story in the course of his oratory over the course of his career. He got it from his mentor and predecessor at Dexter Avenue Baptist Church, Vernon Johns, who scandalized the city of Montgomery in 1952 at the height of segregation, even before the Brown decision. Before I joined Second-Ponce Baptist Church, Reverend Johns put on his bulletin board at Dexter, which is right at the foot of the Capitol in Montgomery, Alabama, the Alabama Capitol, that his sermon titled the following Sunday was Segregation After Death. From this scripture, from Luke 16, the story of Lazarus and Dives. And it caused a huge crisis. I mean, the chief of police came to visit him. What are you talking about? And they forced him to come downtown to a judge and preach the sermon in advance to make sure that it wasn't going to set off some sort of insurrectionary warfare. And also, he said, because some of the white folks probably nurtured a secret hope that there would be segregation after death. And they wanted to know what was his scriptural basis. Now, of course, you heard the reading that the poor person went to heaven and was in Abraham's bosom, and the rich man Dives looked up and saw him there and spoke to Abraham and said, please send Lazarus down here with water to cool my tongue. And the answer was, no, can't do it. And there's a great chasm fixed between us. And Vernon Johns, of course, would say that's segregation. That's what's fixed. That's the chasm fixed. And what is the cause of the chasm? How deep is this to our faith? And of course, he said it's not money. Because it's not money that sent Dives the rich man to hell and poverty that sent Lazarus to heaven, because Dives was only a run-of-the-mill rich man, but Abraham was one of the wealthiest men in all of antiquity. And there he is up in heaven, and he's explaining the cosmos to the newly tormented rich man. What Vernon Johns says, it was not the money, it was the fact that he still saw Lazarus, not even as a person, but as a servant, and didn't even speak to him. Never said, hello, Lazarus. He said, Abraham sent Lazarus. Even in the full revelation of the error of his ways and the basis of his sin and his eternal destiny was based on not seeing Lazarus as a person, he still sees Lazarus as a servant and doesn't speak to him. And Dr. King picked up this story about our failure to see personhood and to reach out for personhood across the gulf that divide us. Speaking, of course, of the racial gulf. And he said, now listen to what Jesus says. He says that the rich man Dives' next instinct is to say, but send him to save my brothers. He has 5 brothers. Now I have 5 brothers and sisters, so I take this very personally myself. Dr. King said he's thinking of others instantly when he realizes that he can't get comfort from missing the essential life lesson that he's being presented by Abraham. Help my brothers and sisters. Dr. King said Dives was a liberal. He was concerned about others. He was instantly concerned with trying to protect other people, which is a very generous and human spirit. And he's arguing with Abraham. Dr. King said throughout the Bible, the Bible favors people who argue with God because they're wrestling with true faith. So here's somebody who's really wrestling, and he's saying, send them to save my brothers. But Abraham says, no, they already have the prophets. They already have Moses and the prophets. They have the Torah and they have the prophets, whose central lesson is to treat people as human beings. And if they're not going to understand it from that, if they're not going to understand it from what the prophet said about how you should treat one another, then they're not even going to, they won't believe it. And he argues with Abraham again and says, yes, but if someone is raised from the dead, if you raise Lazarus from the dead for a quick mission to go down and warn my brothers and sisters, my brothers, he will believe it. They will believe him if he rises from the dead. And Abraham says, no, if they don't believe it from the prophets, they won't believe it even if someone rises from the dead, and comes back and says, the key to your faith, to your fidelity, to your destiny, is whether you treat people as human beings across the lines that divide us, whether you reach out. And Dr. King said this passage burns up all of the differences between Judaism and Christianity. If you can't get the message from the prophets, you won't get the message even from the resurrection. What an extraordinary passage. That was one of Dr. King's favorites. It's one that's really difficult to preach from. But I think in many respects it goes to the heart of Dr. King's message about violence and nonviolence in the world, and what it takes for us to achieve nonviolence in a world that's soaked with violence. That was the heart of Dr. King's message. Toward the end of his life, he kept saying, I don't care how unfashionable nonviolence becomes, I will live with it to the end of my days. I am married to nonviolence. Nonviolence is the heart of our spiritual faith, the attitude that we have toward other people. It's also at the heart of our civic faith, that we believe in votes. And what is a vote but a piece of nonviolence? We live in a cathedral of nonviolence. Our elections are cathedrals of nonviolence in votes instead of bloodshed and coups. And nonviolence is at the heart. And we live in a world that is in a paradox about violence and nonviolence. We've inherited a vast vocabulary of words that pertain to violence. You know, carnage, struggle, mayhem, blitzkrieg, siege, endless words for violence, and very, very few words beside love and the vote. So we're trying to do battle with our inheritance based on these new words and these new concepts. The Bible itself is a struggle with violence in antiquity. The prophets were the first historical figures ever to set violence against righteousness and to hold kings accountable to the way they treated widows and orphans, and to say that violence in the service of the state is evil. They were the first people who ever did that, and lifting up what became, I think, the antecedents of democracy and of our common religious faith, based in equal souls and equal votes. that our spiritual morality is based on every soul is equally valuable, and every vote counts the same. And in some respects, we understand that, and in other respects, we're still trapped in a world that defines power and righteousness even by violence. Violence has been banished from large parts of the world. For 500 years after the Renaissance, the great powers of the world were almost constantly involved in war. It's largely receded. Wars take place today in poor countries, and in rich countries they take place in the poor neighborhoods within rich countries. It's been largely banished. We are dealing today in a world that focuses the light of civilization on violence even among spouses, partners, employers, and employees to condemn violence. There's no place on earth between parents and children about child abuse, things that were foreign concepts when I was growing up. I never heard about. We've made immense strides, and yet we're still trapped in the notion that when things are really tough, we need to pull out violence, that violence will settle things. It will settle all our movies even. Bruce Willis will get dirtier and dirtier, and then finally some supreme act of violence will settle all of the issues. When Dr. King said, quoting the Bible, quoting "We the People," said that violence accomplishes nothing. The only place that I hear people think about violence in the depth that it needs to be considered today is at the National War College, where professional military people respect nonviolence profoundly. They say that they are victimized in the modern world because many political leaders militarize problems that are essentially political about how people relate to one another. And they say that in history, the long-run trend is that since Napoleon industrialized warfare early in the 19th century, the historical trend is that military force destroys more but governs less in the modern world. The way Dr. King put it is that in an interdependent world where we're all coming together, lasting power grows against the grain of violence, not with it. That's why when the Klansmen attacked little girls and children in Birmingham, Alabama, it broke through America's emotional resistance to rise up and break down some of the barriers that had formerly separated people into a gulf like Lazarus and Dives, like the one that separated them. And in our modern world, we also have an economy that separates people and promotes what Dr. King called violence of the spirit. One of the things, quite apart from anything in a sermon about Lazarus and Dives or violence and nonviolence, that I'm trying to call up in difficult ideas from the heart of the civil rights ministry, is that the violent message that we see in life was confronted by a movement with incredible audacity. If you think about nothing else, remember that in 1955, Dr. King said the mission of his movement, that he was not always at the head of, was to do nothing less than redeem the soul of America from the triple scourge of racial bigotry, war, and poverty, which he said were violence of the flesh and violence of the spirit. And he said they were interrelated, and that you couldn't really think about one without dealing with the other. But at the heart of both of them, it is making an effort across the boundaries to see people as people. Violence, and to do violence to someone, you must first dehumanize them. You can't look them in the eye. To go against those boundaries, you have to look people in the eye. You have to become comfortable with being uncomfortable, which is what we were hearing today. And he had to do that all of his life. And most black people, because they live in a predominantly white world, have to do it a lot more than everyone else. And the rest of us need to understand that we have structured our society in ways where we live, where we work, to make it difficult to establish human contact like Lazarus and Dives across the divide that we have. And it's true in our economy as well. The definition of the modern economy is it is creative destruction. It displaces people. It displaces jobs in the course of creating more modern ones. That is a violence. It's a form of violence. And it is now affecting professional people, white people. And there's a tendency to say, well, my job is threatened because of the benefits that have flowed to African Americans. The correct way to see that, if you see personally, is that African Americans have been displaced for centuries, and that this displacement is now working up to people that should have learned from that experience to go forward. I want to close with 2 examples of overcoming through personal witness the great divide that you see in Lazarus and Dives, and the divide that separates us from the instinct to have violence and to defend ourselves in tribal enclaves. In 1964, college students went south for Freedom Summer, trained in nonviolence. The spiritual discipline was also a civic discipline to be self-governing and to build public trust in others in a personal way. On the first night of Freedom Summer, June 21st, 1964, the sheriff of Neshoba County, the deputy sheriff, and a bunch of Klansmen intercepted 3 young civil rights workers and murdered them. Michael Schwerner, James Chaney, and Andrew Goodman. They took them out at night. The sheriff delivered them out at night, and they dragged them out of the car, and the first Klansman put a pistol up against Mickey Schwerner's chest, and Mickey Schwerner's last words were, "Sir, I know just how you feel." Those words disappeared for almost a year until the first Klansman confessed to the FBI and said his last words with the pistol at his chest were, "Sir, I know just how you feel." The FBI agents said, "This is not very likely." He didn't snarl, he didn't beg, he didn't cry, he didn't yell, he wasn't silent. He said, "Sir, I know just how you feel." And the FBI didn't know what to do with that until about 3 months later they got a second confession from a second Klansman in a different state, and he told them the very same thing. "Sir, I know just how you feel." Now those words did not save Mickey Schwerner's life, but they haunted those Klansmen and made them confess, and became testimony to an all-white jury in Mississippi that produced the first conviction that was a step away from the totally divided bipolar society that you had there. The witness for even at the last moment he was trying to make a personal contact with someone, looking them in the eye, and it haunted the Klansmen. The second example I want to offer you is more contemporary. It's from Dr. King's last days. He went to Memphis. I was in Memphis last week. It was quite amusing in a way. They sang "Lift Every Voice and Sing," which is known as the Negro National Anthem. Everybody instinctively stood up. There were 70,000 people. And then the choir director turned and asked everybody to sit down, because he had a very special choral arrangement there, and people didn't know what to do. Some of them sat down, and so that's kind of the tension we had. But the question is, why were we all there? Why were we in Memphis? Why was Dr. King in Memphis? And we all seen the signs, "I am a man," of the sanitation workers walking with "I have a man." But the most moving episode that we saw there was that 2 women, 2 widows, stood up on the balcony of the Lorraine Motel and said, "We are the widows of Echo Cole and Robert Walker. Our husbands were killed on February 1st, 1968. It was a day when Memphis had some of its cyclones. Memphis has severe weather, and it had terrible thunderstorm and rain, and all of Memphis, and indeed all of America, was consumed in the news as to whether Elvis and Priscilla Presley were going to be able to make it across town for Priscilla to give birth to their only child, Lisa Marie Presley, in this terrible weather. And they did finally make it. But at the same time, Echo Cole and Robert Walker were trying to make their way across Memphis as sanitation workers. They were tub men in the back of a sanitation truck, one of those old-fashioned cylindrical ones that had a piston that would compact the garbage. And in those days, the city of Memphis had a rule: all the sanitation workers were black. They had very poor wages, and the equipment was bad. And the rule number one was that under no circumstances should they stop and seek shelter or stop at all in the white neighborhoods of Memphis. That's where they were, driving along. The citizens did not want to be bothered. There was a great gulf fixed. And when the storm got really bad and the lightning came and it was coming down in sheets and the wind blowing, the only place they could go was there were little slits right behind the cab where they could go in with the garbage. And a broom fell on the lever and it compacted both of them with the garbage. The piston came and caught them. And the only eyewitness saw one leg struggling, trying to get out through the slit. And it was in honor of these two people that the sanitation workers said, enough, we must have a strike, and they adopted the slogan, I am a man. But it's only through seeing the people involved there across and hearing these widows that you understand the personal force of an abstract slogan like I am a man. That's what Dr. King was trying to uphold in the Poor People's Campaign at the end of his life. And he went there to make witness for Echo Cole and Robert Walker, which we should do as well. He had a strategy for the Poor People's Campaign. By then, he knew he was not going to capture America, because he said that America is in a revolt or a backlash against all the gains of the civil rights movement that have accomplished since things beyond his imagination in transforming a violent, divided world into one that we're comfortable with. We're comfortable with gay people that he didn't even imagine. The word wasn't even in use then. And our relationship with gay people was a violent one. In the civil rights era, families halted murder investigations for loved ones who were murdered, lest it surfaced the fact that there was homosexuality involved. It was criminal. We've come so far. Dr. King had a plan to do it for poverty in general. It was based on World War I veterans who marched to Washington who were starving in 1932 and marched to ask the government to answer them. Instead, the president ordered the army to drive them out of town. A number of them were killed. The cavalry charged them. They were all encamped. And they lost, and they were very, very unpopular. But what Dr. King said was it started a war in the conscience of American public, that they saw these veterans, starving veterans, being driven out by our army. And 12 years later, that catalyst, that friction, produced the GI Bill that was the greatest leap forward in public policy for education, integration to some degree, although black veterans sadly were excluded from most of it, but in American history. So he said, if we go like the bonus marchers to Washington, it may not succeed in our lifetime, but one day people will reach across the divide, like the divide between Lazarus and Dives, and keep faith with one another, keep faith with equal souls and equal votes once again. And that is the enduring message that beckons us from Dr. King's ministry, from our own faith here at Second-Ponce and for our American faith. We the people, that is so, we've lost sight of how breathtakingly optimistic and responsible all of us as citizens are for lifting us together, we the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the common welfare, and ensure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity. Do ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America. The first sentence of our Constitution, the heart of our faith, they summon us today. Thank you.